Stay tuned for the second half. Jim Morrison and a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Brett Scott, author of The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. Brett, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Hey, Max, good to be here.
All right, you've got a piece out in The Guardian today, which is getting a lot of attention. It's called #1984, Does a Cashless Economy Make for a Surveillance State? So does a cashless economy make for a surveillance state? What's going on here?
Not yet, but I fear that the powers that be are trying to make it so. So the basic gist of the article is that right now cash is the only way that we can actually do transactions that are not monitorable. But various state authorities plus commercial bodies like MasterCard and the banks are trying to push for this cashless society, which basically in a nutshell means that every single transaction you do has to go via a bank.
And we see this, I think, most progressively, if you can use that term, in Sweden, I think, at the moment, is the country that's kind of leading the world in this.
Absolutely. Well, Sweden and also actually places like Amsterdam. If you go to like, Netherlands and Amsterdam, there's some shops that won't accept cash anymore.
So let's talk a little bit about this. So in other words, when you have cash in your pocket and you go and you buy a pint of milk or something, that's an anonymous transaction. Nobody really knows you're buying this milk, and you have a certain degree of privacy in what you're doing.
Now, you might be able to call it a peer-to-peer transaction, actually, like only we know about it. You know?
Yeah, and so that's part of the private space that people enjoy, and part of a human right would be to enjoy some private space. The idea of having your space, every single transaction completely monitored and surveyed by the state is an incredible overreach by the state. But of course, so that would be one of the arguments against having all money turned into surveyable.
Yeah, so let's just put this in context. I mean, when you go and let's say I go to the coffee shop and I buy my coffee with cash, only me and the coffee shop owner know about it. But if I'm suddenly having to go via a card payment system, there's an intermediary in the process, which means, and they're basically, what's happening is that two banks are actually transacting on our behalf. Now, this obviously opens up the potential for then every transaction to be viewed, but which that could be like the bank itself viewing it, but it could also be passed on to state authorities theoretically. That in turn opens up a second possibility, which is censorship. So if you can view every transaction that people do, you can start to potentially stop them from transacting with certain groups. So for example, actually, if MasterCard or one of these groups decided that I was an unsavory figure, they could turn off Brett's card. He can no longer engage in electronic payment. Now, in a society where your only option is to engage in electronic payment, that could be a very problematic thing.
We saw this with Julian Assange, where the money he was raising for his legal defense, suddenly MasterCard and I believe Visa just cut him off the grid. We see this on a global scale with Iran. Iran was cut off in the Forex market.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, you know what? I was actually just in Turkey recently and was during the Ankara bombings, and the government at some point was like, we're just going to turn off Facebook and Twitter. Now, that was an attempt to stop protest and to sort of quell protest by stopping communication. Now, imagine that they also had the ability to simultaneously stop payments by activist groups. So not only can you not communicate, but you also can't go down to buy paper to make pamphlets. So there's huge amounts of power that gives a quasi-authoritarian body if they wanted to stop action.
Well, let's give another example here. Let's say all of your transactions are going to this enormous database, and this database is shared effectively by innumerable institutions and corporations. And with these big trade deals like TPP now, all these corporations are cooperating globally to create this super state that's sovereign only to itself, and individual sovereignty is lost. But let's say you go to the corner store and you're buying a chocolate bar, and you use your electronic payment system, and suddenly the database is calculating this versus your insurance payments, which are adjusted for a pre-diabetic condition. So now suddenly your insurance just goes up because it's like you're only allowed one chocolate bar a month. This is now bringing you to 2 chocolate bars a month. You're a pre-diabetic. Now we're going to charge you more for insurance. So it becomes a way for the state to confiscate wealth above and beyond things like negative interest rates.
You might even think about these as being data mergers that companies can start doing, So like, why do you think, people like Google and Apple are getting into this business? Because they realize, we have payments on our phones, Plus, we also have location data on our phones at the same time. So you can start to correlate different data sets with each other to try and create synergies. Now, that might be one company doing that, but it could be companies entering into deals with each other. And then, of course, there's a state element of it as well. The state can start to get involved in that too. And actually, in this space, you see a lot of collaboration between government bodies and corporates. I mean, right now on the London Underground, there's this big push for contactless payment, which is basically electronic payment. Who's behind it? The Mayor of London and MasterCard, and also Barclaycard. And actually, one of them, and I was checking this morning, there's this charity called Penny for London. Now, Penny for London is trying to make out that if you use contactless cards, you're doing great things for charity because you can donate 1 pence every time you do a contactless transaction. If you look at who's behind Penny for London, it's none other than Barclaycard itself. And actually on its board are people like Stanley Fink and Bob Diamond, a lot of big financiers, and Boris Johnson backs us. So there's a kind of a collaboration between these state entities and corporate entities.
Well, it's one of the problems when you don't put bankers who have committed fraud, committed illegal activities in jail. They surface, they float to the surface again, and they take new jobs and they commit more fraud. I mean, that's what the amazing thing here in this country, unlike Iceland, which put banksters in jail. They didn't put any banksters in jail. So the guys who committed massive fraud 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they've got new jobs, big jobs, and they're just continuing this.
Well, actually, if you look at this, these guys behind this contactless stuff on the underground, I mean, Stanley Fink is one of the guys who started Man Group, which is one of the biggest hedge fund groups in the world. He also happens to be on the Conservative Party treasurer, one of the co-treasurers of the Conservative Party.
Right,
so
again,
these links are everywhere, basically.
Well, there's an incentive to apply the rule of law, because you want to put criminals in jail. You don't want to give them raises and big job promotions. But, another aspect to all this is that it can lead towards social engineering. I remember we had a guest on the show a while ago who used to work at one of the big credit card companies, and they were doing the Forex exchanges, which people are traveling and they get money out of the bank and they get the conversion for the local currency. And when the quarter was ending and that company needed to get higher earnings, they simply adjusted the rate at which the fees that they were getting. It was completely adjustable. So they can use this grid of perpetual and ubiquitous electronic transactions to create social, to steer the population. So let's say you want the Conservative Party, for example, decides they want to remain in power. So suddenly they're able to adjust the cost of things that in such a way to steer people like sheep, going into the abattoir, or
one of the most sort of talked about things related to cashless society so far is the potential for what's called negative interest rates. And you mentioned this earlier. If the only way that you can hold money is in the form of electronic bank deposits rather than cash, it opens the way for central banks to basically put negative interest rates to erode your bank balances, and therefore in a time of a recession to actually try to make you spend or force you to spend. Now, this has never really been used, but people like Andy Haldane have been talking about this recently, saying this is the one reason.
Who is that? Explain.
So Andy Haldane is the chief economist of the Bank of England, and he recently just came out and said, one of the reasons why we want cashless society is so we can start doing innovative monetary policy.
Like NIRP, negative interest rates, as you point out. There's no incentive you can't save money, and if you can't save money, you lose your economic sovereignty. Part of the idea of being free in a free society is you have economic sovereignty. You have some degree to participate in the economy as you wish to participate.
Yeah, and actually, if you want to think about another example that's going on right now, one of the things about cashless society is that it systematically excludes people who are marginalized. So imagine you're a refugee who's arrived in a country and you don't have a permanent abode or a permanent place where you stay. No bank is going to give you a bank account in that situation. If you can't get a bank account in a cashless society, you cannot engage in exchange. So basically, a type of person like that arriving in a country like that won't be able to actually engage in the economy at all.
They become outcasts.
Exactly.
They have a permanent underclass. And now, Bitcoin, of course, completely challenges all of this. And it was in 2008, 2009, when it emerged, the white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto talked really in those terms that they were concerned about where these central banks were going, and they created this distributed cryptocurrency that offers some anonymity, and anyone can create essentially a bank account. You don't need to relate to the banks. It completely gets around the entire banking system.
Yeah.
So your thoughts on electronic, cryptocurrencies Does it play into a
Yeah,
solution?
totally. So like one of the reasons, probably the main reason why I support Bitcoin is purely because it's the one type of electronic payment that provides a counterpower to the normal bank payment system. Now, I actually don't believe that Bitcoin will ever somehow take over all transactions, but it's a very, very important lifeline to have there in a world where you have no choice but to engage in electronic payment. So it could almost be seen as the future form of digital cash. It will allow you at least some little lifeline of anonymity and some kind of privacy to your transactions.
When we first started talking about it, of course, it was quite pristine in its elegance and such a beautiful design, and everyone was so excited about it. Now, a few years later, the banks are getting into the space with their private blockchains, their privileged blockchains, to incur great economies of scale internally for their own cost savings, but this is a bit of a sad development because there was a time when the world, if it had just gone to Bitcoin, we would be rid of these banksters forever. But there was so much negative propaganda out there that, oh, it's used for money laundering, as if the big banks aren't the biggest money launderers in the world.
Exactly.
But now we're in a foot race because now the big banks are into the blockchain technology, so the public.
Yeah, although at the same time, bear in mind, one of the simplest ways of talking about blockchain technology, well, I don't know if it's simple, but it's a distributed database technology. So rather than having centralized databases, you have distributed databases. Now, that could be used by many different players. It's not, there's nothing saying that banks wouldn't use that. It doesn't mean, though, that, ordinary citizens can't use it for their own purposes as well. So I guess in the initial days of Bitcoin, people sort of assumed that big players wouldn't get involved. We've now learned that that's not the case. But it doesn't mean that it's something that's not useful anymore.
Okay, so to kind of summarize your point here, and this is getting a lot of traction out there. It's # 1984. Does a cashless economy make for a surveillance state? By Brett Scott. This is burning up the Twitter sphere. So to sum it up, your point basically is that these move toward electronic money is dangerous in the sense that it's just amplifying all the worst tendencies of the surveillance state.
Well, let's put it, it's concentrating power in very large financial institutions, yeah, and we should have reason to be concerned about that, and we shouldn't sort of sleepwalk into a financial surveillance state without realizing it. So we should at least try to hold these groups to an account and sort of work on the alternatives.
Well, hopefully there'll be a waking up of the public toward this, and they'll have some kind of epiphany, but we can hope, I suppose. Anyway, thanks for being on the Kaiser Report.
No problem, Max.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Brett Scott, author of The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Kaiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.